Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, since Thursday, we've been looking at two key subjects. The rencontre économique in Aix, the economy, of course, and the fact that it really is very hot. This brings us together, it worries us, and it's raising questions. And so, in the full of this heat wave, at the beginning of the week, the French Council for the Climate published its 2025 report, which you can see online. It said that in 2024 was the hottest year ever recorded in the world. In France and in Europe, extreme events are growing, intensifying, and accelerating. And in the face of that, public action is not sufficient. Insufficient in terms of investment, insufficient in terms of planning, with a negative impact on our trajectory in terms of CO2 reduction. The subject which we're going to be talking about for the next hour today is really at the heart of our concerns. It's about preserving common goods. So, alongside me, I'm delighted to welcome Carlos Alvarado QUESADA, who's the former president of Costa Rica. Alain-Richard DONWAHI, who's president of COP15 of the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification and Drought. Thank you for being with us. Then we have Véronique, who's Chief Executive Officer of Nexity. Philippe PASCAL, who's Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Paris Airports Group. And then Philippe BAJOU, who's the Deputy CEO of the Poste Office Group in France. And it is Anne Perrault who will be introducing the debate on behalf of the Circle of Economists. Thank you, Isabel. So given what we're talking about, it's worth just defining the purpose of this session. And that's not as straightforward as you might imagine. For economists, there is this concept that has been long defined, the notion of public goods. And this means that there is no rivalry. So when one person consumes the good, it doesn't prevent other individuals from consuming. So here we're talking about public lighting, national defense, and then also non-exclusion. That's the other fact that defines a public good, i.e. we cannot exclude people from benefiting from this, even if people have not taken part in funding and financing this. But here we're talking not about public goods, but common goods. So this means that it's a little bit more vague, but there are nevertheless a number of different definitions, and perhaps we could fix one of them, which would define common goods as things that there can be a rivalry, so consumption by some may prevent others from using them, but they remain non-exclusive. So we can't exclude people from using them, whether or not they've paid for this good. And then beyond common goods, there are other goods that are part of the same category and are treated together with them by economists. So these are goods that create externalities, positive or negative externalities. So knowledge, healthcare, vaccination, we'll come back to that later. These are goods that lead to externalities that are treated in the same way as public goods and common goods for the reasons I'm going to explain to you. So all of these goods, what do they have in common? Well, the truth is they are produced in non-optimal ways. If we only work and depend on market mechanisms, and if we only work with rational economic agents. So, for example, vaccination. If you decide whether to be vaccinated or not, generally, except in a situation of a major epidemic, I won't talk about COVID here, but you tend to make a decision based on what how vaccination is going to benefit you, and any issues that you might have, what it might cost you, fever that you might have as a side effect. But you tend to poorly take into account the fact that in vaccinating yourself, you are protecting other people from disease. And this is a good that has a positive externality. And so we can't just depend on individual calculations of agents to ensure that a good is produced and consumed in quantities that are effective for the collective. Of course, there are also negative externalities. We're going to talk a lot about CO2, but perhaps an example which would be closer to us geographically, a common good which is a public good. There is over-tourism, which leads to tourism nuisances. So, for example, here in the Calanque, in the region, when we invite people to pay for entrance to the Calanque National Park, we are trying to manage the handling of this common good, and that opens up a whole lot of debate about what kind of public policy we need to adapt when over-tourism threatens to destroy natural sites such as the Calanque. Should we regulate through quantity and say that the 200 first people to arrive are those who will have the right to enter, or are we going to say, well, people should pay and only people who accept to pay will be able to enter the Calanque? So this opens up another debate which is really fundamental today. Given the extent of these common goods, how can we design public policies that are acceptable for people? And of course, there is this question that if we get people to pay externalities, that means we're going to take people out of consumption. Of course, we want to reduce consumption. And what we're going to do, though, is exclude some people from consumption who would like to be able to, for example, go to the Calanque or have pure air, etc. So these negative externalities of public policy is really essential. So if we, for example, think of these questions, we think of acceptability associated with the carbon tax and also feasibility. So if there was a carbon tax associated to a single continent, well, there's a risk that businesses leave this area to another country, and actually overall we'd have no impact on pollution. Generally there'd be an impact on local economy because business would leave, but it's not good for the climate either because these businesses are simply going to go to countries where there are less restrictions around polluting procedures, and therefore that will just increase CO2 emissions globally. And so policies that are not thought through in a smart way, and I just want to say it really is very complicated to think about these policies in a really comprehensive way. So often we prioritize the objectives that we have, but you can see with this example that we really need to think about how we're going to make pricing of externalities more efficient. So, for example, putting in place taxes is a good thing because when prices rise, demand falls. And so everyone agrees that that will therefore reduce consumption or CO2 production. But it's much more complicated from the perspective of acceptability. But there are solutions. So we could give possibilities to people who want to move freely in an area, but we can put in place taxes or incentives to encourage people to modify. So there can be standard transfers which don't depend on behaviors to compensate what will be charged elsewhere when people travel, for example, in an internal combustion engine vehicle. That could be a way perhaps to help people to accept carbon tax. So I think we're going to be talking about all these questions, but all these questions are really very complex, and so I'm really delighted to introduce this panel session. Thank you very much, Anne. Carlos Alvarado Quesada, so you are the former president of Costa Rica. Between May 2018 and May 2022, Costa Rica is an excellent example, a model example of the Paris Accords. You haven't had an army since 1948. Your energy is almost 100% renewable, and you have reversed the process of deforestation. So my question is very simple. How can you tell us specifically how do we preserve common goods? Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be speaking English.
Examples. One of the recent past of how to work in public common goods, and what are we looking to the future, but going to the COP in Brazil, and what is we're aiming to do. So in 2019, Costa Rica hosted the pre-COP in San Jose, and before that, the Paris Agreement that was agreed in 2015, there was the agreement but not concrete roadmap to implementation. So in Costa Rica, we did one thing. We created the first decarbonization plan in the planet after the Paris Agreement to how to implement that roadmap in a sustainable economic way to disengage growth and well-being from emissions. But another thing we do connected to that was what is known now as the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. So together with France, with the UK, Costa Rica, small group of countries said the following. Life in the planet is connected to nature. Everything we eat, we use, everything around us, what we breathe, depends on nature. If we exhaust nature, we exhaust ourselves. And that is not a hypothesis. It's a matter of time. So scientifically, it's proposed that we need to preserve at least 30% of ecosystems in land and 30% of ecosystems in the ocean if we are to survive. And the dare was to do it by 2030. And that was the High Ambition Coalition 2019. Back then, everybody said, it's too ambitious, it's impossible, it's not going to happen, it's too expensive. But after 2019, it was 4 countries. A couple of months later, it was 40 countries. By 2022, more than 100 countries adopted that goal. And in the COP of Biodiversity on December of 2022, 190 countries agreed through diplomacy and multilateralism to protect 30% of the ocean and 30% of the land. Very few people know that, but it's perhaps one of the most important advancements to protect the planet. And in our case, because we want to lead by example, while I was president, we had already protected more than 30% of our land. But Costa Rica territory is only 8% land. We are 52% ocean. And our ocean was only 3% protected. So we took the next level and we went from 3% of ocean protected to 30% around the Cocos Island. That 30% is larger than Costa Rica in the continent. That is to preserve oxygen. That is to preserve the future of tuna fish resources to feed the planet. It has lots of positive spillovers, but somebody has to pay for that. So it was the government of Costa Rica, philanthropies, taxation, private support, and other government support that made that a reality. And that is happening in many countries. Also, Panama did the same, Colombia did the same, Ecuador did the same. And now in the Pacific Islands is moving into that direction. So that to say, yes, it's possible what seemed impossible. But what are we heading now? Tropical forest. It's one of the main assets to preserve oxygen, to absorb carbon, to protect biodiversity. The problem, not enough money to finance it. What is it we're aiming to do as a global community towards Brazil? And I end that with that. The mechanism is called the TFFF, the Tropical Forestry Fund Forever. So how is it that we're going to fund the protection of the tropical forest? We need to create a fund of a couple of $100 billion from governments, from private sector. But it's not a grant. It's a hedge fund that goes to market in sustainable investments. And the profit from those investments go to the forest and to the indigenous communities. So we create a fund that creates wealth, and that wealth is directed to the fund. So it's not a grant scheme. But also the wealth serves to pay back the investment, and that ownership goes to the owners of the forest. So that's the mechanism we're putting into place toward Belén. One caveat, it needs to be born big to be allowed to do all that. But if we manage to do that, we'll be protecting tropical forest in the planet, not with grants or with loans, but through investment. And I'm sure that many people here with CEOs of companies might be interested to listen more to that, but that's the next generation of how we protect common goods.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur QUESADA.
Very much, Mr. QUESADA. So, the president of COP15, you worked on the desertification, the degradation of soils, which is a problem at the world level, which impacts Africa, your country of origin, your continent of origin. 80% of the land no longer produces a phenomenon that's amplified by climate warming and human activity, which has a very negative impact on food safety and food security and the impoverishment of populations. Do you agree with Mr. QUESADA, Mr. DONWAHI, to try to embark a certain number of countries to work on issues of such importance, you know, when the governments can have eventually other concerns to deal with, immediate concerns to work on? Well, I agree with my neighbor, not because I know him already, but because Costa Rica is a model for a lot of countries in the world. A model because, one, they understood that we needed to change our mindset, change our behaviors, accept that things needed to change, first thing. And they demonstrated by not having an armed force for 70 years now, they use these funds for the environment. So I wouldn't have a job there because I was the Minister of Defense in my country, so I wouldn't have had a job. But I was also Minister of Water and Forests, so that's why I went to Costa Rica as a Minister of Water and Forests to see what they were doing there. But I think there needs to be a change of mindset at the highest level. The level of the government, the populations, to have the good behavior with a view to common goods and the environment. And for this, you have to raise the awareness of people. First of all, the elected representatives that we are, then the populations. And the populations are difficult to make aware because the concept of common good is not well understood by all. In a lot of societies in Africa and the Ivory Coast, at least what I witnessed, being an elected representative, some populations concern the common good as belonging to no one. So we don't take care of it because nobody owns it. We don't take care of the forests because nobody owns them. We put our waste in the streets because it doesn't belong to anybody. We don't maintain the common good because there's no ownership, and often because we don't pay taxes or taxes on that. And so the concept of common good is not necessarily well understood by all. But we need to be concerned with this and take care of it. If I take the case of the Ivory Coast, when we realized that we had destroyed 80% of our forests in 6 years, not only by cutting the trees, but by developing agriculture. So agriculture, farming activities, of course, had a strong impact on the destruction of the forest. When we realized that, well, we had to take immediate decisions, urgent decisions to change the trend. And so we had to have an institutional program, change the legislation. We had to develop a new forest code and laws to be adapted to the objectives we had set, and also develop new policies with set goals, clear goals, targets for 2030 to be able to proceed with the reforestation, replant trees, and change the trend. So it's a major project which is ongoing and that we have to finance. So when we have budgets that are turned towards immediate achievements for the well-being of communities in a developing country, for the basic infrastructure. Well, you can understand that the forest is not at the top of the list of our concerns. And so those investments are not at the on top of the list. So we had to think of financing by counting on on ourselves, and then on external contribution. But you know, external contributions, we have a lot of international conference, a lot of COPs since 30 years, a lot of summits where us elected representatives make a lot of declarations, and then afterwards we do nothing. And we end up a year or 2 years later to talk about the same thing. So you can't count on outside investments. Regarding the Ivory Coast, we cover 30% of our investments. We had to count on internal resources. So internal resources, how do you mobilize them? Notably the private sector. The private sector will invest only if it has a good return on investment, if they consider the reforestation is an investment, a protection of nature. So we try to develop a policy that enabled the private sector to invest in the reforestation process with agroforestry, a concept that is quite innovative to enable the private sector to invest in agroforestry and thus finance reforestation. So the revenue, the income, the return on investment is drawn from the foodstuff, from the agricultural products, and the state, of course, finances with the private sector the reforestation. Something quite innovative that wasn't accepted by the international financial systems. They thought that agriculture would destroy the forest and we couldn't mix agriculture and forest, but we have to mix it, yes, when it's beneficial, and ensure that the forest is not considered as a good only something to preserve, but as a resource that is sustainable. So that needs to be renewed. So thank you very much, Mr. DONWAHI. So the transition with you, Véronique, the president of Nexity, the CEO, the role of the private sector and of corporations, businesses. So the question is, how do we reconcile the end of the world and the end of the month? How do we reconcile the preservation of common goods and the need to build housing? Well, it's an interesting question. I must admit that when Les Rencontres d'Experts offered me to take the floor on this round table, I felt, well, my job is not on that. I'm a promoter, you know the iconography. I'm a person who produces cubic meters of concrete, destroys biodiversity, and obviously, and we did that. We destroy farmlands. And so what I feel like saying today, my job today and with my teams is an activity that is quite different, that's changed a lot since I joined Nexity 8 years ago. My job consists in producing housing. In sustainable development, you have to never forget the human beings. You know, when you leave the human being aside, there's a backlash. So my trade consists in offering housing to everybody. I'm not going to go back on the issue of housing, but I'm just saying that we excluded youth from big urban areas for ownership or for rentals. The youth today can't afford housing in the heart of the cities, downtown areas. It was not a topic when I was young, but it's a very, very serious problem. And we accompany the mayors in the transformation of the city. That's my job. And the topic of common goods is now at the heart of our trade. The protection of the common good is a big topic of the 21st century. And for us, in Nexity, it forces us to redefine our work. Our first common good, water. So don't listen, please. We have drinking water in our toilets, in our washing machines, in our showers. So that can be, you know, it can be discussed. So we proposed a white book on water, and we established partnerships to use potable water and drinking water in a better way and have decentralized systems that enable to deal with these topics. Another common good, I was in someone on the train, he saw my documents and everything, and he asked me questions. And I said, well, a common good or a rare product is real estate. And he just broke down in tears and laughing. And he said, madam, we can build everywhere, but this ignores what you said. In the end, today our life is linked with the space we leave to nature. Very important. And this new awareness is new. I'm looking at the land available for construction. I wouldn't go there, but anyway. But it's a really new awareness how we protect the ecosystems. I think that one of the rare promoters who approved the law on non-artificialization of the soil. It's important to leave room for nature that we need to survive, but it changes our activity, it changes our trade. In X, I always try to convince on reasonable development. When you have real estate in downtown areas and that I'm asked to build one story when you could just build three, and it's a waste because you have to find housing to people, and it's inside the city, so why not approve 3-story high buildings? And there's also the problem of urban regeneration. It's very complex. Much more difficult to transform downtown area land than to build housing out in nature, in the outskirts. But it's more reasonable in the downtown areas. You have water, you have all the utilities, you have transport. If you leave the city, you have cars. So it's essential, not easy. But what I find interesting, besides the standards, I think that everybody should take their own responsibility. If everybody took their responsibility, the governments, private operators, and also the individuals, we would go much faster. My company is committed. We've always been committed. I have a trajectory for 2025, and I respect it. And I think, I'm sorry to go back on my trade, but it's a comparative advantage. Because today, when I'm talking to a mayor and he's convinced that in the end, this balance between the human being and the respect of nature is really at the heart of my business. I think I have a competitive advantage when I talk to the mayor with these words. And so both are not incompatible in the private sector. Thank you very much, Véronique BÉDAGUE. Philippe Pascal, CEO of the Paris Airport Group. Going to the recent study on the social and transport environment, the CO2 emissions of air transport have increased by 4% in 2024 and have remained stable at the European level, roughly 5 Vespas. The decarbonization of this sector, despite the best will in the world, despite all technological advances and the framework, you can no longer travel from Paris to Bordeaux fly from Paris to Bordeaux nowadays. Isn't that a waste of time? And the decarbonization of the system, isn't that a mere illusion? Sorry for this harsh question.
Thank you for this very direct question. First of all, to say for the aviation sector, dealing with carbon is absolutely essential. The aviation sector is only going to exist in the long term if it succeeds in reducing carbon. It's an obligation for the aviation sector, but also for the environment and the world. Our job is to connect people, to connect nations, and connecting them is the opposite of this trend to withdraw into ourselves. And when you look at the introduction from the person who created the International Aviation Organization, the focus is about bringing people together. So your question is inviting me to encourage that this possibility of reducing carbon is actually possible. And so this is with an ambitious roadmap we're going to make this possible, and it's going to be achievable. If we think about aviation that could be used in a reasoned way, i.e. that everyone uses an airplane when it's necessary and relevant from an environmental perspective. This is the case, and we're seeing with young people, for example, today, people who are the most sensitive to the environment are those who travel more and more. So that's the first point. We need to really lobby for a reasoned use of air transport. So that means that we need to focus on intermodal options. Airplanes are not the competitors of train. We are allies. We also need to work on reducing the carbon of our activities. And here I'm going to try and analyze things a bit. So there's three aspects. There's reducing carbon on the ground, reducing carbon in the construction of infrastructure, and then reducing carbon in terms of flights. On the ground, we've been working on this for over 15 years. Like most airports around the world, we've done 80% of the work. We will, by 2030, Orly in Paris will be totally carbon-free, 2035 for Charles de Gaulle. This links into the way we deal with fleets, also the way in which aeroplanes are connected to electric power when they're on the ground. It's also about how we cool and heat the buildings using geothermal power, which is already in place in Orly and which is being wrapped up now in Charles de Gaulle. And it's also where we think about energy sources. And then there's also an intermodal approach. So this also means preventing cars from coming. And this is why we need to have intermodal approaches. So line 14 of the metro has come to Orly. Line 17 and 18 are going to be going to Charles de Gaulle and Orly. And then various other transport links are making this station a key aspect. The second aspect is construction. Today we are trying to add new construction methods by recycling materials. New materials are constructed from low-carbon concrete or wood, including in our airports and in our most beautiful infrastructure. And the third aspect is the reduction of carbon around flights. There are three technologies here. There's electricity, sustainable fuel, and hydrogen. Electricity, this is not a fiction. Safran has certified its first electric engine, and it's going to be a nine-seater plane is going to be approved in about 2.5 years. And then it will be 18 seaters, etc., etc. And soon, in the long term, I'm talking 2030, 2035, internal flights will be electric flights. In terms of sustainable fuel, this is the second technology. We don't need new infrastructure for this. Infrastructure that use kerosene can work with sustainable fuel. Air France is the leading purchaser of sustainable fuel in the world. We've recently had jets that arrived using 100% sustainable fuel, but the challenge is to develop a whole industry around this, and we're working with the whole aviation sector on this. So we're also developing synthetic sustainable fuel, and that has a dual advantage. It can be used in flights, but it's also made using CO2 emissions. And then there's the third technology, which is hydrogen. Hydrogen is already operational on the ground. The technology is there, but once there is a business model in place, for the moment there isn't a business model in place because hydrogen takes space and therefore it takes seats, so the business model doesn't work yet at the moment. Thank you very much. Philippe BAJOU, you are Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Poste Group. I'm sorry, but you're also one of the big logistics players. and you deliver a whole number of packages. Your key competitors are Amazon and others, so you pollute a great deal. What are you doing to reduce the pollution associated with your activity? Is that really just something that's just impossible? Is it just bluff? Or are you going to show that it's actually possible to reduce carbon in your activity? Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you really very, very much, Isabel, for this direct question. I just want to go 50 years back in the past into 1964. I can see some young people smiling, but some people who are my age will remember. They'll remember that there was a presidential candidate called Raymond, who said that the greatest threat for our planet was the increase of the rate of carbon in our atmosphere. And I think that from what we can see from all the fans around the room is that we have concrete proof of that here in Aix and all around the world. So yes, we are a big logistics group. We deliver in France. To just talk about France, we deliver 50% of packages every day. And in 2012, we decided that we need to work really seriously on our carbon footprint. So we decided to electrify our vehicle fleet. This was not an easy decision to make financially, and it wasn't easy technologically either. Why? Because financially, thermal combustion engines seemed cheaper over the long term, and technically in France there was no electric vehicle production sector in France at the time. And we knew that with the growth of e-commerce, we were going to contribute to the saturation of cities, to pollution, and perhaps to public health issues. So that's why we made this decision. So, of course, we could have waited to make this decision for the public authorities, as they did for passengers. They organized public transport. Public transport became a public good, but we thought that perhaps they would do the same thing. And in terms of what's still happening around the low emission zones, we're still waiting for this. But we've talked a lot about natural common goods, but I'd like us to expand the subject a little bit in the way that we heard from Anne Perrault in terms of social common goods. We are extremely committed in this area because we want to ensure that we are present across the whole of our French territory. We must continue to welcome the whole population in all of our contact points, whether it's a vulnerable population or whether these are wealthy population. We need to offer them opportunities for transport of their goods. We need to operate banking options, insurance options, mobile phone options, and also help people who are struggling with digital technology to work with this technology. So you're going to say to me, well, of course, you are a public company. And I'll say, well, yes, but we are 100% in a competitive environment. We have competitors in all of our activities. So what happens when a responsible business that is concerned about how it consumes common goods and sometimes reduce its production when it's necessary? And what happens when it's faced with businesses that are only seeking profit? What happens when this business decides to use clean, more expensive production methods? Well, it's clear. The business loses market share, and there's a potential for it being excluded from the market. And at that point, the person that wins is the person who is less respectful of the environment, who consumes common goods and destroys collective well-being. So it's good to be a responsible company. It's good to be a company that is careful with common goods, but in the long term, does it work? Do we not need a framework that's going to make it possible to have long-term competition? Do we not need a framework for that? Thank you very much for that. So we're going to try and go round very quickly now. So please try and be very concise so that everyone can speak. Mr. BAJOU was asking whether we need a framework. And we're not talking about so there will be no disloyal competition. And so we've heard, Mr. Carlos Alvarado Quesada, we've heard your ambitions, we've heard about how you want to fund this through the private sector, but in a world that's increasingly fragmented, and we can see what's happening around the United States and how unpredictable it is, do you not feel like we're actually going backwards? And do you not feel that what you've built on paper might end up in the bin, with some people who are deciding that actually it's the law of the strongest that really works today? Sorry, that was a very long question, but...
I really enjoyed the interventions, what I heard, particularly Monsieur Pascal when he said, our craft is to connect. I wish more politicians say that. Our craft is to connect, not to divide. Let's put it this way, we're talking about common goods. So we tend to put the attention on the goods. There's a question underlying there. The common goods for whom? And that is important. Is it the common goods for the Costa Ricans? Or for Côte d'Ivoire? Or for France? It's common goods in the sense that it's shared. Again, by whom? We tend to think now of East and West, competition, of North and South, inequality, justice. But the notion of common goods, of connection, only makes sense in a scenario in what we share is common humanity. And therefore, everybody has the right for those goods. That's the only scenario in which that makes sense. Because if I don't see the humanity in the other, why will I see the right in the other for that good? And that I'm afraid that's what's happening with fragmentation. We want to arm ourselves. Why? To protect. And to protect what from the other? And then we have that notion to privatize some of the good for us. Who is the us? If we have an us, that means there is a them. And that is destroying us. And that, as my friend minister said, Alain, it starts with a mind shift. First thing to preserve common goods, it's finance, yes, it's the money, it's the mechanisms, but it starts here and here, recognizing the humanity of the others and being willing to connect to the others, even though, especially if we disagree. And that's, I believe, the challenge today we have.
Merci beaucoup. DONWAHI.
Thank you very much, Mr. DONWAHI. We understood how you embarked corporations by showing that there could be a profitable activity when preserving common goods, but you also demonstrated it was more complicated to involve the populations who don't feel concerned. So shouldn't we create special tax schemes or set a public frame that coordinates or constrains eventually? You know, what do you think of that? Well, as far as the governments or authorities, obviously you have to adapt. We have to adapt our policies to the population's concern. But what I think is the most important is to be inclusive, include these populations in the seeking of solutions so that they feel concerned, involved. And if you don't do that, and we saw that earlier, the President mentioned just before of the indigenous populations, and we see in a lot of the policies that are implemented to fight against desertification, the lack or there's not sufficient action to include indigenous populations who often have ancestral solutions for the preservation of common goods, because it's the modernity that led them to talk about private goods. It wasn't in their mindset before that. So these communities had the sense of community, the sense of the common good and the preservation of this common good. And it's modern life that led them to talk about private, and us talk about private goods. So really taking over these public goods. And we should step back and go to these communities which often have solutions to preserve the common good. And I think the politicians and government authorities have to take them into account too. So thank you. Monsieur, you were for, Madame BÉDAGUE, you were for standards to protect against the artificialization of soil. So we have to continue to add regulations. We should respect and not step back. You also started by saying some elected representatives say there are too many environmental rules. You talk about the low emission zones, for example, and you think that we should resist. I think we're doing good, but at the same time, I think the common good cannot boil down to standards. And the Green City for a long time was the standard. We talked about standards, but it's the first tier. There's a lot to say on the Green City, on the reality of nature in the cities. But I think there's a second common good, and that stems naturally from what you said. I think I wrote a book a few months ago on what I call praising the cities. And I think everybody was talking about the Green City, but the Blue City is also important. The Blue City is the city of being happy to live together, and I think we have to promote both. If you impose a Green City, it's a bit what you're saying, without also working on the social relations and the pleasure of living together, then it will collapse. And when I look at the city, we have to work on inclusion. I'm shocked to see that we've pushed the youth outside the hearts of the cities, and obviously uncivil behaviors is a poison. I was reading the paper this morning, some pools were closed down all over France because of uncivil behaviors. So we deprive a lot of people from a tool that they need today, especially with this warm spell, the Blue City, the city of inclusion, of public space. In our development activities, we work on the public spaces. I talk about beauty also. I think beauty is important. You'll say, oh, it's a subjective element, but no. So to work increasingly on the Blue City, and I am now, Green City, everybody talks about that, but I'm a big defender of the Blue City, a promoter of the Blue City with this blue background. Perfectly. It matches. And so Philippe, both Philips have talked about unloyal competition. It's good to work on carbon emissions and to preserve common goods, but it's good to have rules, but not everybody follow the same rules. You're subject to a tax on transport infrastructure. We called it the ADP tax, Aéroport de Paris tax. You're the only airport that's subject to this tax. Should we make this frame evolve? Shouldn't the authorities work on, yes, we preserve the common goods, but following the same rules for everybody? Thank you for this question. Maybe 3 elements of response. First, the enterprise and the relevant action. The enterprise is good, has the capacity to act, the capacity to finance, and we have the agility to do so. If we are, if we apply reasoned rulings, and we also have a long-term vision. The ADP Group, we're in everyday operations, but we also manage infrastructure, so we project ourselves in the long term, and it's this projection that that leads to the fact that we're connected to the common good. And that's what's important. First element of answer. The second would be we are in competition. We compete. We're subject to economic regulations in France and in Europe because for monopoly laws, but we're in real competition with other airports in the world that don't have the same constraints, even environmentally wise. So we are hindering the capacity of financing, the capacity to invest on decarbonation. So now we go back to what Ampero was saying on the contradiction between the individual interest and the need to work on the common good. And the third thing is taxes. These taxes will weigh, especially those that you mentioned, exclusively on ADP for the aerial sector, and these taxes will hinder this capacity. It means that it's fine when you have 2 or 3 scratches, but if you have a lot more scratches, then and every year you have to redo everything, it hurts and it weighs on the capacity to decarbonate. Thank you. Philippe BAJOU. So Philippe BAJOU, so you have to make profits, okay, be profitable, faced with a competitor like Amazon, and on the other side we had the debate, should we deliver the mail every day? You have other public service missions. We talked about social cohesion, connecting people, and so it's difficult for a company, a public company, and that has a private service. That's why I was asking that we have a clear framework. But before going back on that, I would like to thank Véronique BÉDAGUE for the notion of Blue City, because in the end, with the Blue City, she perfectly illustrates part of the social common good. And the clear setting we need is a governance, whether it's local, national, or international. And that's what we ask at La Poste. It's a concrete example because, as said by the former president of the COP15, it's something that belongs to nobody, but that everybody uses. That's a common good. And so we need to have a governance over that. It exists in certain sectors like fisheries. It's the basis, that's basic. And then 3 pillars. First pillar is regulations. It's not standards there. It's to avoid predator behaviors and to avoid that some exclude others from the consumption of this common good or access to this common. It's essential. Maybe you need controls and sanctions. And the second pillar is we need to facilitate, ease, try to encourage and to adapt to the regulations, and then you need financing. And when it's a collective good, you need collective financing. And this collective financing, after that you have all the possible solutions, but in any case, everybody has to contribute according to their means, individual means. And to go back on the missions of a public service, I think that a social common good, we can establish a link with the missions of a public service. But a social common good, it's not in a minimum service. It's not a protection net for the most vulnerable. We may have been vulnerable at one moment in our lives, and maybe we will be tomorrow. So a social common good is a common good for everyone, everybody. It's something that opens up phenomenal perspectives to be able to develop the well-being together and the well-being together, the well-living together. So the concluding words of yours, Ampero, to close this round table, unless there's a question. There's a question. 2 questions from the room. Very, very, very fast. After it's lunchtime, so we can have 5 minutes, so we take 5 minutes. Good morning, Philippe Caz. I would like to ask a question. You know, we heard that for developing countries it was a question of will, that there were things to do, and we're told also it's a question of technology. So do you need technology, or today is the financial will enough, the will to find financing enough to do your decarbonating activities? Were you addressing a question in particular? No? Yes? So do you need technology or finance?
Some of things. It's not one or the other. Sometimes developing countries actually, because of the lack of resources, come up with the innovations to others to adopt. But it's a mix of things. One of perhaps the learnings I've had in this journey is that there's not one journey for all. The agency, the freedom is to identify where you are in this pathway and try to create it together. Sometimes when I speak in forums with youth of African countries, and one young student from Nigeria, a country that exports more than 90% of its exports is fossil fuels. And she says to me, very nice talk, Mr. President, but what can I do in Nigeria? So perhaps the learning there is that there are not two same pathways, but we all need to learn what our pathway is. So Nigeria, Costa Rica have to understand what is the way. But there has to be a way. In the case of Nigeria, if by 2050 demand of fossil fuels decreases, they're out of the game. If they change today, they're also out of the game. So what's the option? Creating those options. It's critical, with agency, with freedom, and an understanding of that. And we lack a little bit of understanding.
Est-ce que je peux compléter? Il y a un article.
Yeah, I can add to this. There's an interesting article by Jacques Attali. I think it's in the newspaper Echo, the Echoes. He says we have to find solutions. You know where he finds the solutions? In my trade, he looks at what's happening in Africa, in terms of architecture, in terms of materials used. Exactly because of what you're saying. Let's not mistake where we find innovation today. No, I would like to add, yes, we need technology, new technologies. It can bring solutions for us, enable us to go faster by spending less. So technology, yes, we have a need for technology, and we can also develop it ourselves. So good. My name is Galadias from CPEC. It's one of the main think tanks in Latin America. My question is for President ALVARADO.
It really struck me how you said our craft is to
Pardon, il comprend le français, comme ça tout le monde comprend votre question.
C'est plus.
It's more difficult in French for me on the crisis of disaffiliation. It's a question, a crisis of disaffiliation, I call it, with an individualistic growth, a crisis with all the institutions, not only institutions, the trade unions, the family even. And that is a necessary condition to be able to implement the governance we need to address common good. So how do we operate? What do we do? This individualism of course, raises difficulties to reach this notion of the common goods. And the difficulty to reach common goods, it fuels the disaffiliation. 2 minutes to answer. Thank you also for the question.
You see, I don't want to impose an answer. I want to offer the best answer I have for that question, which is a question I put myself every day. When we see the world today with war, we have the resources to end up hunger, we don't do. We see the crisis in democracy. We are transitioning to a new humanity. Artificial intelligence is changing who we are as human beings. And that brings a little bit of anxiety, frustration. I see it especially in young people. What's the world is going to be of us? So what's my best answer? That's why I emphasize now on the change, but the change that we control. And what is the change that we control? If you put your hope for change on a better world on somebody else, you're putting your destiny on somebody else's hands. The thing that we control in life is the time we have been given with the use of our mind, our body, our soul, and our effort. And that's what we control. Many will say, that's too little, that's too few. Well, tell that to Nelson Mandela. Tell that to Martin Luther King. What was the big army they had? What was the innovative technology which changed the world? What was the finance? How many missiles they control? They control their ideas, their resilience, and their will. And that we all have. So we have to put in exercise our power of ideas, of love, for change. And that we control every day. So it's moving into that direction. That's what I'm hopeful, because I know that tomorrow I have more time to keep working in what I believe in. And I also believe that I recognize others' humanity, and like me, we can agree sometimes to walk together. And that gives me hope.
Merci beaucoup pour ce message d'espoir.
Thank you for this message of hope, and this will close our round table. Because this time, well, we're out of time. Thank you.